Welcome to the first event in the Freedom and Captivity Monday Night series, sponsored by the Center for the Arts and Humanities at Colby College. Freedom and Captivity is the annual theme for the center this year, and the Monday Night series has been organized by three Colby faculty members, Chandra Bimal in African American Studies and Anthropology, Gwyn Shanks in Theater and Dance, and myself, Catherine Besteman, from Colby's Anthropology Department. Our theme of Freedom and Captivity is an opportunity to explore what we mean by liberation. What does liberation, and most specifically, liberation in an abolitionist society, look like, feel like, move like, sound like, read like? We'll be meeting virtually every Monday night throughout the fall with speakers, performers, artists, and scholars to explore this set of questions. I'll also note that the Colby Freedom and Captivity series is a companion series to a statewide project, also called Freedom and Captivity, that is working with a coalition of partners towards an abolitionist vision for Maine. And you can check out that initiative at freedomandcaptivity.org. For the Colby series, we'd love to thank Dean Albritton and Megan Fossa of the Center for the Arts and Humanities for supporting the series. And we'd also like to acknowledge all the programs and departments listed here on the welcoming side who have contributed to the series. We couldn't have done this without all of their help. So tonight's panel kicks off the series. Our three panelists will be responding to the question that frames and guides our work this fall. What is abolition for the 21st century? The panelists are Ori Burton, Dylan Rodriguez, and Jackie Wang. Ori Burton is an anthropologist at American University whose work focuses on Black-led movements against state repression and for systematic and structural transformation. You can check out his fantastic YouTube primer, which is called Abolition 101. Dylan Rodriguez is professor of media and cultural studies at University of California, Riverside, and past president of the American Studies Association. A founding member of Critical Resistance, Professor Rodriguez's most recent monograph is called Suspended Apocalypse: White Supremacy, Genocide, and the Filipino Condition. Jackie Wang is professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC, is also a poet and a musician, and her book, Carceral Capitalism, is amazing. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to bow out now and ask the three panelists to begin. Ori is going to lead us off by addressing the question, what is abolition for the 21st century?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for inviting me here, and to everyone at Colby College. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Dylan and Jackie. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So yeah, in thinking about this question, what is abolition in the 21st century? I'm kind of grappling with abolition itself as a contested concept with, contested histories, a contested genealogy. And so, my initial response is, whose abolition are we talking about? Because I'm increasingly thinking about how we're all enmeshed within a fairly sophisticated regime of psychological warfare, by which I mean a coordinated effort to influence our beliefs and our behaviors via propaganda and other means. And so I'm always thinking about the extent to which our communications and organizing infrastructure is dependent upon a corporatized and monetized and thoroughly militarized technologies like Facebook or Zoom or Google or Microsoft or Amazon or the like, and how our politics and our understanding of what's possible and of reality itself are molded by these technologies. And I mention this because on the one hand, we've experienced an explosion of abolitionist discourse and engagement and interest in abolitionist politics over the last decade, and this is partly due to those technologies. But at the same time, they've facilitated the rapid co-optation of abolitionist discourse and things like defund the police, which get taken up by mainstream media and then distorted. And people's timelines become inundated with propaganda about crime waves and how dangerous it is to be a cop, or our failures are presented to us as victories. like, with the Minneapolis school board voting to sever its relationship with cops in schools, but we also might not have heard that the district replaced those cops with a private security firm owned by a former prison guard and staffed by ex-police and ex-military, right? And so that's sort of the context in which I'm thinking about struggles around abolition. My particular genealogy and my understanding of abolition as both theory and method comes, through my organizing work in the 2000s, and then more recently through my research on the Black radical prison movement in the 1970s in New York and elsewhere. And that genealogy offers a particular understanding of abolition as anti-carceral insurgency, in which people put their lives on the line to abolish the conditions of their captivity in a very immediate and material sense. And what I've learned from that work suggests that abolition is the active process and the methodology of carving out a space for us to exist in more egalitarian ways, right? It's not the pristine end result of that struggle, but rather the process of living through insurgency and creating through insurgency. And we see this principle operating, in the period I study. We also see evidence of it in the way that jailhouse lawyers speak is calling for a kind of radical militant solidarity between outside and inside the prison walls to collectively shut the prisons down, right? And so that's sort of where I'm coming from. What would it mean to actually materialize the relationship that jailhouse lawyers speak is calling for, right? And what does it mean to take seriously that abolition as a political and intellectual project actually grows from these sort of urgent sites of struggle and rebellion. And so I think just at a more practical level, I mean, when we talk about abolition, we're talking about the national security state. And so when you think about it that way, it becomes kind of overwhelming. And so for me, it's about looking at these sort of small local projects in which people are creating new ways of existing in sites of terror and captivity, and thinking about how can we reproduce these new ways of being, and how can we expand them, and how can we connect the kinds of local work that people are doing in different places to make them sustainable. So that's where I'll end.
Great. I think it's my turn to speak, so I'll just jump in here. I wanted to thank Catherine for bringing us together here today, and everyone at Colby for convening this panel. And I also want to thank Ori and Dylan. It's nice. I think Dylan and I have met virtually once, but Ori and I were supposed to be on a panel together years ago, but I didn't see you that time. So it's nice to meet you in person this time. I'm going to kind of pick up on some themes. I do want to return to the technology question that Ori brought up, and we'll get to that in the conversation. But I do want to go back to what Ori was talking about in terms of the abolition of the national security state. Thinking about abolition in the 21st century, it seems like one unanswered question that I have is the question of how to relate to the state. And I don't think there is a consensus among abolitionists on how to think about the state. So I'm going to talk through some of my thinking and ambivalences around this question, because I do ultimately agree with what Ori was saying, which is abolition is about the abolition of the national security state. So the question of how abolitionists should relate to the state is a question that has plagued me for years. And I'm going to be very honest here. I come out of a queer, anarchist, communist political community that has a decisively antagonistic relationship to the state and the repressive organs of the state, including but not limited to prisons and police. I was radicalized not only by the experience of having a brother sentenced to juvenile life without parole, but by organizations like the anarchist Black Cross, the movement to free political prisoners, and queer insurrectionist critiques of homonormativity and gay marriage. And I'm definitely, I would say, a student of revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s. So my abolitionist position is rooted in a belief that the state is inherently repressive, and that as an enforcer of contracts, it represents the interests of the settler property class. And the state has a self-preserving reflex that always results in the crushing of revolution and political dissent, as exemplified by the history of COINTELPRO and the assassination of Black Power revolutionaries. As someone opposed to private property, I believe that bourgeois law undergirds the settler colonial state and is about the maintenance of white supremacy and class relations. If the state is fundamentally defined by its monopoly on force and violence, then it may be nearly impossible to separate the security function of the state, embodied by warfare abroad and domestic policing at home, from the state as a provider of public goods. I do want to say that I am like somewhat sympathetic to what Ruthie Gilmore says about the pro-state state. Like, we should care about the organized provisioning of public goods. It's a question of whether we think that that necessarily has to take the form of the state. Or there's also this question of whether the state is a thing or whether it's a field of contestation. So if it's not a thing and we can just define it however we want, maybe that would lead us to be more sympathetic, but I really don't think you can separate the security function of the state, which is fundamentally rooted in repression and the crushing of political dissent, from what the state is overall. But I will say that a part of me is sympathetic to questions around redistribution. And so I'm just going to lay out some ambivalences I have here. So the anarchist part of me believes that the state will always be repressive and should be overthrown. The pragmatic part of me thinks that if we are stuck with the state, we should demand Medicare for all, social housing, free college, the cancellation of student debt, and so forth. The anarchist part of me thinks we should abolish the family. The pragmatist thinks that cash payments to families could go a long way in ending child poverty. The pragmatist thinks a federal jobs guarantee could help people locked out of the formal economy. The anarchist retorts that we should abolish work itself. The anarchist part of me believes that mutual aid is necessary for building collective social bonds, for experimenting with new forms of life and modes of being together modeled on community and care. The pragmatist replies that not everything can be solved with mutual aid, given the level of investment required to address environmental racism and upgrade our crumbling toxic infrastructure. So I'm thinking about situations like Jackson, Mississippi, where it will cost an estimated $2 billion to upgrade the city's water system, which is over 6 times the city's annual budget. So with that said, I do want to propose that abolition in the 21st century should include the abolition of the state, or the form of the state as it currently exists. But at the same time, I support the organized provisioning of public goods and am internally conflicted about the question of scale. But I want to conclude with a reminder that abolition is a process of reimagining social formations and experimenting with new forms of life. And I will also agree with Ori about the question of whose genealogy of abolition are we thinking about? Because I am getting, I think, a little bit frustrated with the way that abolition has been folded in the mainstream as meaning simply redistribution in a social democratic sense. Like, let's just divert resources rather than thinking about a revolutionary anti-capitalist political program.
This is so good. I'm really enjoying this already. This is so good. I appreciate the fact that Chandra, Gwen, and Catherine, that you put the three of us in conversation in this unmoderated way. I feel like we're going to run out of time so quick, and we're going to kick ourselves for not talking through this and forcing you to give us another extra hour. But I'm just so grateful for being invited into this discussion with Ori and with Jackie. I want to acknowledge that I live on occupied Kauai and Tonga land in Southern California, and that the place I work is down the street from where the Riverside Police Department brutally took the life of Tyisha Miller in 1998, shortly before I started my job here. I try to always start by acknowledging where I'm speaking and working from. So I think I'm mostly going to echo what my colleagues here have already said in some ways, and maybe elaborate and highlight some particular points that I think are worth emphasizing. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's really critical to constantly insist on grounding abolitionist genealogies and praxis, regardless of what historical period we're thinking about, in what Cedric Robinson, of course, famously calls the Black radical tradition. And to think about this Black radical tradition as one that is constantly undergoing internal critique, debate, change, creative departures, and movement. So when we say tradition, it's not like the white folks' tradition, right? This is a tradition that's always under duress. It's always dealing with conditions of acute violence, acute violence, right? It's both mediated, but it's always present. That's what I mean by acute. I don't mean it's not always mediated. It's not always the same thing, but it is acute. It is pressing. It is always there. So I think it's critical on the one hand to think about how abolition in general, and certainly abolition in the 21st century, is not merely a central part of what Robinson calls the Black radical tradition. In many ways, it is the Black radical tradition as a constantly changing, wild, collective creative project. So I insist on that. I want to really amplify what Jackie kind of ended with, which is, I think, some of the misappropriations, maybe to be generous about it, somewhat graceful about it, the misinterpretations, maybe the partial readings, the misreadings of what the abolitionist genealogy encompasses and what is constitutive of its spine, of its dynamic spine. It's this Black revolutionary radical tradition. It is Marronage, it is the plantation revolt, it is the creative and radical futurities and visions and speculations that flow from everybody who wants to see the complete eradication of plantation power in all of its forms, whether it's 2021 or 1721. So that's how I want to start, is to think about abolition that way. And then I want to come back to something that Ori started with, and in which Jackie, I think, also picked up on, which is when we think abolition in the 21st century, particularly right now, particularly in this current, breathing moment that we're sharing right now, abolition is taking shape in the context of a sophisticated, multi-layered counterinsurgency. I deeply appreciate and embrace how Ori started his comments by talking about psychological warfare. That is a central part of how the counterinsurgency happens. And I want to emphasize the fact the multi-layered counterinsurgency absolutely takes the shape of mobilizations of state and police power all the time. I know we see it. I know probably most of the people, if not all the people that are here, already kind of think about ourselves as knowing this, but I think it's worth restating every day, all day, that this is a continuity. The mobilizations of counterinsurgent state and police power is a part of a continuity. It never went anywhere. You know, almost 20 years ago, I remember when Judith Butler and other kind of white progressives and white radicals were wringing their hands over the introduction of this thing called the Patriot Act. And I remember people like a lot of us that are sitting here were rolling our eyes at our white progressive comrades, as smart as they are, as much as we admire them, as much as we respect them. We were saying that shit has been there for at least 50 years in the form that Jackie already invoked of the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, the FBI, right? All that Patriot Act did was, you know, kind of publicize it, put it into wider circulation and re-articulate it a little bit. So we got to understand how the psychological warfare is happening and how these layers of counterinsurgency are part of a continuity. So one part of that is the mobilization of state and police power all the time. Another part of it that we also see, but which I think we tend to fail to frame as counterinsurgency, is extra state repression. These reactionary far-right terrorist pieces of shit that are constantly trying to scare, intimidate, and actually kill some of our folks and loved ones, right? That's part of a terrorist campaign, a far-right terrorist campaign. And part of the psychological, part of the psyops is the intervention that the state makes. And this is where I'm down with, as anarchist and analysis an anarchist can get, in how the state will then seize on its own repressive apparatus to engage in these ceremonies of disciplining the reactionary far right, to bring them under what they perform as the rule of law after the terrorist, you know, the terrorist campaign has in their minds already been unleashed, because you can't rein that in, right? Once the terror circulates, there's no way to make that stop, right? It's there. So there are those forms of counterinsurgency. The part that I really want to emphasize, I think, in my opening comments tonight, is how the counterinsurgency is, in this particular moment, post-2020, is taking the form of reformism. And this is not the same thing as reform, right? I see reform as a kind of tactical set of alternatives that we have to address and analyze on a kind of case-by-case basis, right? Abolitionists have a long kind of set of you know, analytical protocols in figuring out whether reform is abolition friendly or whether it's actually repressing, moving toward abolition. I'm not talking about reform, I'm talking about reformism. I'm talking about this kind of religious, proto-religious political ideology that stipulates that reform is the horizon of political and institutional historical change. That is the moment we are in. We're in a moment where reformism is being mobilized at every possible institutional site, across every possible scale, and through various forms of appropriation of language, including appropriation of abolitionist language. So what we actually have is a reformist apparatus that is so capacious that it is using the terms, it is using the catchphrases, it is using the keywords of abolition. It is using radical words to articulate a reformist, you know, ideology, to bring people back into, try to hail people into the proto-religious apparatus of reform. One of the examples that makes my eyes water is how the state, including universities, university administrations, and cops and DAs, are taking the language of transformative justice, right? Which is you know, it's deeply connected to the abolitionist kind of movement, right? They're taking the language and even some of the protocols and procedures of transformative justice and bringing it right into the publicly performed protocols of criminal justice. And they're using the sophisticated language of transformative justice to talk about what is, in essence, an expansion of the criminal justice apparatus. Right? And what you have are cops, police chiefs, university administrators as the ones who are actually executing transformative justice. So we're in a reformist moment. We're in a reformist moment in which abolition is being brought into the protocols of reform. That is counterinsurgency. That is the attempt to seize the hearts and minds of people who are or would potentially be on the side of the set of wild debates and struggles that constitute what abolition is and can be and will always constantly be becoming in the current moment and into this futurity that we're always speculating about. So I'll finish with this. I think if I was pushed right now to think about what I privilege or what I prioritize the most about abolition in the 21st century, in addition to the fact that it is always a collective creativity, right? It's never an individual identity. It's never an outcome. You know, this was part of the discourse in 2020, where I would struggle with people about this all the time, especially a kind of newer activists who thought about abolition as some kind of endpoint or outcome. Now saying, no, this is a method. It's a way we do shit. It's how we like talk to each other and envision things and analyze and formulate things. So abolition is not an outcome. I also want to say that I'm increasingly intimate with, and this will probably put me at odds with some abolitionist folks or some folks who see themselves as abolitionists. I'm increasingly intimate with violence. I feel myself increasingly intimate with violence. And it depends when you talk to me what I mean by that. I'll be transparent with you all. In a way, I have no fucks left to give, so I'm just going to be open with you. You know, I feel like this might be a role that some of us can and should play, is to encourage an intimacy with violence. I think if we look at the historical record, this genealogy of Black revolutionary, Black abolitionist, you know, hemispheric and diasporic struggle, there was always a willingness to be intimate with violence. Intimacy, right? Now, I'm talking about something which is deep, which is thoughtful, which is collective, which is shared, which is contested. And so it's an intimacy. I think in the 2021 abolition, I'm going to be even more specific than 21st century. 2020 abolition in 2021 moving forward, I think has to embrace an intimacy with violence that thinks about different creative ways to weaponize the skills, resources, collective wealth, knowledge, creativity, art, and study that different people engage in, right? That is whatever resources and fluencies you have access to. Part of the challenge for abolitionists and abolitionist praxis in the current and future moments is to weaponize those skills, resources, and that collective wealth. Weaponize it. It has to be weaponized, and I'm talking collective study is a profound weapon that I think is one of the things that is centrally repressed by the psyops and by the reformist apparatus that is constantly pushing us toward the most vulgar versions of the pragmatism. I mean, the pragmatism that Jackie shared with us is an abolitionist one. I'm talking about the most vulgar forms of pragmatism that we're talking about that tries to squash I think vibrant and constant radical necessity of collective study. And I'm talking about not just collective study, but weaponizing collective study and weaponizing it toward some kind of creative horizon that encourages people to speculate, that encourages people to think and work and envision in creative and wild ways. I'm thinking about folks working and creating and making in the tradition of that Black abolitionist speculation. I'm thinking everybody from Nat Turner to Safia Bukhari. If you look at their work and their legacies, they're all about that kind of radical collective speculation. So I'm about being intimate with my own and your rage, being intimate with the violence and embracing our collective wildness. I think this is what Jackie's kind of messing with, right? This antagonism between the anarchists and the pragmatists. This in a crystallized form, that's the wildness we're talking about. And I'm starting to believe that wildness, meaning the totality, right? The abolitionist totality, all that shit that's happening among devoted, collectively working and thinking abolitionists, all the struggles we have with each other. I'm saying that's the wildness. I'm not saying wildness is some kind of program somewhere. I'm saying it's the opposite. Since all the shit that we try to work out all the time, and all the vision we try to work through, all the speculation that we sometimes fail to share, but every now and then we do share. That wildness is what the state, it's what the forces beyond the state, and it's what counterinsurgency can't quite fucking deal with. Right? They can deal with a platform, they can deal with an agenda, they know how to repress that stuff, right? So we are always tactical and strategic when we undertake certain programs and platforms and forms of struggle. But the wildness is something we can't even get our heads around it. So the counterinsurgency cannot figure out how to quench the wildness. Now, the state and the counterinsurgency, they're always trying to tame wildness. They're always trying to domesticate wildlife. They're always trying to liquidate or neutralize the wildlife, meaning this totality we're talking about. And so I feel like abolition right now for the foreseeable future has to not merely be intimate with the violence, but it has to embrace and honor and love its own wildness. I'll pause there.
Yeah, I mean, you're completely channeling what I've been thinking about lately, which is actually embracing ungovernability. We don't need to like recuperate those wild energies into some kind of party platform or something that, you know, the counterinsurgency knows how to deal with. I want to open the conversation with a question for Ori, because you started the conversation talking about technologies of repression and organizing infrastructure. And this is something that I've been thinking about when we think about the communication technologies we even rely on to communicate with people who are incarcerated. So if we think about, you know, using platforms like, you know, JPay tablets to do messaging to incarcerated people. I've been thinking about the implications of technological mediation on political organizing. So what does it mean for the communication between incarcerated people, activists on the outside? What does it mean for it to be surveilled? And I've been doing a bit of research on voice surveillance and prison telecommunications companies, and literally the counterinsurgency security tools that are embedded in the communication infrastructure that incarcerated people use. So I wanted to ask you, Ori, if you have any thoughts about the question of organizing as it relates to technology. So how can we circumvent or not rely on these surveilled and corporatized technologies and communication infrastructures?
Yeah, right on. I mean, clearly this forum itself militates against having this conversation in a real way, right? Because it's impersonal, because it's mediated through Zoom. I mean, I think we have to think about technology in a really broad sense. First of all, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said. I would perhaps offer a slight reframing in terms of, I think maybe when we talk about counterinsurgency and its forebear pacification, the word repression might be overused at times, because really what we're talking about is repression and solicitation, inducement, invitation, these sort of subtle forms of inviting people to engage in political activity that will stabilize as opposed to disrupt and create that kind of wildness that we're talking about. And that solicitation is made all the more enticing because the alternative is the kind of acute forms of violence and suffering that Dylan is talking about. But I think about, you know, technology often, and specifically you mentioned JPay, which is something I think about often. I just published an essay that's about letter writing and about the process of letter writing as a form of political communication between the inside and outside. And there's a whole history, you know, part of the Attica Rebellion was made possible because of letter writing and was actually carried out through letter writing in the way that incarcerated people were able to distribute their propaganda through letters. And so I definitely view the insinuation of JPay, especially in places like Pennsylvania, right, where you can only communicate digitally, right? You can write a letter, but it gets diverted to Florida where they scan it. Who knows what they do with the original document? Who knows what kinds of software they're running it through? And then the person who it's addressed to gets an email, which they view on their tablet. Clearly that email is being run through with algorithms searching for specific keywords, searching for, you know, specific ways of specific coding mechanisms. Clearly, it's also probably keeping a record of what people are desiring, what they want, as a way potentially to market products to incarcerated people and their loved ones. And so I definitely think what we're experiencing is the gradual replacement of traditional letter writing capabilities with an all digital sort of experience, which if you talk to people who rely on that, will tell you it's convenient, it's fast, you can send pictures, you can Zoom with your loved ones and they can like see the dogs or see the family. Like it creates an experience that otherwise is impossible, but there's a really high cost, right? And this is how counterinsurgency works, right? It raises the costs of certain forms of rebellion while making the desired path of resistance easier. And just to return, I think part of why I'm thinking about psychological warfare so specifically, I'm writing a book on prisons in New York, and obviously a major figure in that arena is Nelson Rockefeller, who ordered the massacre at Attica, but also in the 1950s was basically oversaw the national psychological warfare program for the United States under Eisenhower. And, the Rockefeller Foundation was deeply involved in developing psychological warfare techniques, right? And so these techniques then get deployed after Attica, and they become internalized into the prison system. And New York and California, in terms of sort of carceral technology, have always sort of been on the cutting edge. And so there's a way in which the notion of psychological warfare is actually quite material and specific, right? It's not an abstraction, it's not a metaphor, it's the actual logic through which the sort of reformist post-Attica prison came into being and continues to operate. And so I think the question you asked, Jackie, is exactly the right question, right? How do we, what is our relationship to these technologies? How can we cultivate other forms of speaking with each other, being with each other that don't involve, which are, in which they aren't, mediated and sort of vulnerable to surveillance. But, letters were also vulnerable to surveillance, right? And people found ways to circumvent that. And so we sort of have to also honor and cultivate that kind of genius and creativity that always comes, right? The counterinsurgency is never total. There's always spaces for escape. There's always spaces for innovation. And, that sort of cycle of revolutionary creativity on the one end, and, this constant effort not only to destroy via repression, but to institutionalize via solicitation, to capture that radical and revolutionary language and to re-articulate it, right? I mean, there's a quote in the counterinsurgency field manual that says, skilled counterinsurgents can destroy an insurgency by appropriating its cause. Like that is what it is, right? And in fact, that's the desired strategy, right? State violence is always it's always sort of in the background, because to the extent that state violence becomes necessary to maintain order, it has a sort of, also it has an after effect of affirming resistance, right? And producing more resistance, right? And so these sort of soft and solicitous methods are the primary means by which counterinsurgency operates within and outside of prisons. And that's why it's so difficult, because it's hard to see and perceive. And because it feels good often, and it's convenient, and it's designed to meet people's needs in a certain kind of way. And so that's what I'll say about that.
Is it okay if I chime in real quick on this, where we're flowing with this? Because I think there's a key word that we need to keep track of all the time when we're thinking about how to navigate a moment of counterinsurgency, and the keyword is legitimacy. That what we've had is a beautiful moment in which the legitimacy of something like police power as normalized anti-Blackness is fundamentally put to question and dislodged as legitimate, right? It's actually subjected to a pretty rigorous collective destruction, the legitimacy of it. So what happens is a scramble to try to reinstate the legitimacy. And so that's part of the abolitionist, I think, task, analytical task, is to try to understand what the solicitations are doing to bring folks back into the exercises of consent that allow the existing, not just institutions, but the existing paradigms of power to re-legitimate. And that's what you see when you talk about something like what went down in Minneapolis, and what's going down, frankly, all over the place in different ways, are attempts to re-articulate police power through extra police institutions, social workers, right? Now we're seeing social workers and healthcare providers as the first, that's the big reform all over the place. Social workers, healthcare professionals, I should say, are the first line of response now, instead of the police, right? And of course, rudimentary examination of those reforms shows us that what those folks are actually being deputized to do is to serve as the extremity of police power. Right? They're not the badge and gun-toting cops, but they're a direct extension of the police. They're actually a new expression, an expansive expression of police power. So what you actually have are more fucking deputies, right? And you actually, in almost every case, you have no shrinking of actual police personnel anyways, right? So what's funny about this conversation is I was actually literally looking at that exact passage that Ori just paraphrased from the counterinsurgency manual. That's part of the reason I put it up in the chat. Y'all need to read that. Even if you just skip around and read the sections, you need to understand what the US Army, what the US military mean by counterinsurgency. And also note that in the counterinsurgency field manual of the US Army, there is nothing in there that reserves it for extra domestic war. There's nothing in there that distinguishes it as a manual that is only reserved for extra domestic war. This is absolutely a manual that, on the one hand, builds from domestic counterinsurgency and is intended as a primary reference point for the domestic forms of counterinsurgency. But that's one of the other things that you constantly see is this the cultural the counterinsurgency's cultural weapon is that which is oriented around legitimacy. And so that's part of what I think abolitionist insurgency needs to constantly attack, right? And it has to attack it by attacking it, not just by proposing other forms of legitimate security, for example, like housing and food and recreational and housing, alternate forms of security are fine. Mutual aid that Jackie brought up, that's fine. But I think there has to be a constant attack on these dominant genocidal anti-Black colonial forms of legitimacy, paradigms of power that are constantly scrambling to re-legitimate when they're being challenged and dislodged like this. I mean, that's where this is at.
Yeah, I think it was really well put in terms of, Ori, what you said, and Dylan, your expansion of what Ori said, because I always think of reform. If we look at the history of reform, in some sense, we can see, what happened in the 60s and 70s repeating itself today. But if we actually look at the so-called failures of reforms, and we look at things like the bail reform movement of the 1960s, it's not actually that the reforms failed. There was this crisis of legitimacy, and reform became the process by which the carceral state expanded. So it wasn't that reforms were trying to check the expansion of the carceral state, that the form that the expansion actually took was reform. So I think it's really important to be really aware of this point. I mean, Angela Davis has made this point, Michel Foucault makes this point, but we really need to recalibrate how we think of reform. And I thought it was really well put, Ori, what you said about thinking about the solicitous methods of counterinsurgency. So it's not just brute repression. It's not just, oh, let's stamp out abolition, let's assassinate the abolitionists. It's actually the more insidious method of counterinsurgency is like, let's try to integrate abolition and do it in a way that actually makes it a tool of the expansion of the carceral state and settler colonial capitalism. I think that's like a super, super important point to make. And it is something that's hard to put your finger on because maybe we're primed to think of repression in negative terms, and that, the state uses force as a way to crush a revolution or an upswell of insurgent energies. And that is usually not the form that it takes. That's kind of the last resort, actually.
That's right. And part of it is because of what Dylan just said, right? The extent to which brute force is deployed, right? That interrupts legitimacy, which is the ultimate goal, right? And so, right, there's this sort of common sense notion that reform automatically entails some kind of a egalitarian, moral, ethical transfer of power that emerges from a sort of like a moral awakening in the holders of power who, faced with this protest, suddenly decide that they're going to give up power. But if you actually read, the other thing you could do, like you could read the counterinsurgency field manual. You could also read any document that describes the operations of military prisons in times of war, because they talk about reform throughout those documents, but it's very clear that reform is a solicitation to basically cleave that portion of the population that can be won, so that the population that can't be won over is isolated, and so that population can be neutralized, and neutralized is a euphemism for convert, capture, and kill. It's just clear there, right? There's something about the way in which these sort of documents that are produced within a liberal democracy can't be that forthcoming about what it is that they're actually doing, but when they're talking about what they're doing overseas, they put it all out there.
So what this is saying to me is a couple things. On the one hand, there's another part of the counterinsurgency field manual that thinks about how it is that I have it in front of me. It says successful conduct of counterinsurgency operations depends on thoroughly understanding the society and culture within which they are being conducted. That points directly at probably the vast majority of the people who are on this call and listening to us talk, meaning academics.
Yep.
Right. I think something that we need to identify if we're going to be serious about the totality of embracing the wildness and also kind of the precise and rigorous analysis that abolitionist praxis has offered us as an archive, is the role that professional intellectuals, academics in particular, but not just academics, but academics in particular play in building the kind of edifices through which counterinsurgency operations will find their pathways toward relegitimation by becoming more expert, right, and more fluent in some of the languages of the rebellion. So this is the role that academia has historically played in aiding both the solicitous and pedagogical, consent winning forms, the hearts and minds aspects of counterinsurgency, which in turn also lubricate the machinery for the below ground forms of militarized and brutal repression. So I think that's one part of this. What it also points to then is that there's another kind of antagonism to think about the way Jackie talked about the antagonism in the opening comments. On the one hand, the reason I'm here with you all is because a community of people who came from decades of abolitionist work were graceful and generous in embracing me to be part of the work when I was essentially useless to it. Right. But you know what I mean? Like they were like, okay, you want to fight. So we're going to find a way to make you useful to this movement, and then you're going to grow with us. Right. So there's a grace and a generosity to that. And I honor that. And I try to practice it the best way I can most of the time. There's another thing in tension with that, which is maybe we need to be more kind of intentional about the fact that there's a principled kind of analytical discipline that abolitionists need to bring into these different fields of struggle, so that we're not being generous at the cost of abolitionist principles, right? And abolitionist analysis, abolitionist, trajectories. Knowing that we have to be disciplined in how we share that grace and generosity, because otherwise we're actually equipping the counterinsurgency. Right, we're actually allowing it to happen. We're enabling it and we're empowering it by allowing folks to get away with things that are just unprincipled. So I think that's part of this. And I don't mean to sound sectarian, because that's not really what it is. But there is a sense of, I think, intellectual political discipline that has to be with this. And frankly, a lot of that comes out with collective work. If folks are in collectives with each other, every collective I've ever been in that identifies as abolitionists, this is the shit we hash out, right? And we even hash out the ways in which we think we share principles, but maybe we don't really. So now we got to talk about that too. That's the collective study I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about reading groups, y'all. I'm not talking about watching films together only. I'm talking about that. I'm talking about collective struggle. That's study. But I think this is really critical, that we actually be explicit about identifying the particular ground on which even our conversation takes place as one of the principal ways in which counterinsurgency operations kind of build the expertise, build the fluency, and build their weaponized apparatus. So this the grounds for the struggle against counterinsurgency and the abolitionist struggle to generate that kind of graceful and generous weaponization of collective thought. It's literally everywhere, but it's in some ways it's especially right here. And can I ask you all a question? That I need help with this. I need help with it from all 115 people that are in this room. But I'll direct it to you two. What do y'all think we need to rethink or change in the way you or we engage in abolitionist pedagogies, right? And interpret that broadly. I don't just necessarily mean in the college or university classroom. I'm talking about in conversation with people, in trying to do work and organizing and trying to do art. If you're an artist, trying to do creative shit, what do we need to rethink and change about our pedagogical approaches? Because I think, the pedagogical strategy is utterly central right now. It always is, right? But I think it's utterly central right now because of the need to develop a kind of effective kind of counter move to the counterinsurgency. So are y'all thinking about this? And please share with me. I need your help.
It's a really great question. I feel like I have such problems with authority, so I treat classes like a reading group because I'm like, I really feel uncomfortable being in the role of a professor, because to me, study doesn't take a hierarchical form, and teaching within the academy, it forces you into a certain form, whereas the professor, you're responsible for evaluating students. So I can say, okay, I'm not going to play gatekeeper in this context. Let's try to work this shit out together. That's usually how I approach it, but it is a really, really difficult position to occupy, because I'm so used to study and struggle as the formation that intellectual work takes. Most of my political education has happened in collectives and reading groups and things like that. And one question that I'm really struggling with that came up, and I'm teaching a carceral studies grad seminar, and we were really struggling with this question of whether or not as an abolitionist, whether you have a responsibility to try to persuade the public, or if that is something that inherently neutralizes you. Like this whole question of appealing to an abstract audience, trying to win them over. I think that's kind of how we can get into this trap of abolition isn't really abolition. It's just about redirecting resources, and let's, put more money into rec centers and less money into policing. So I do struggle around this question of whether or not, whether or not we should be out there trying to make a pitch, or whether that is inherently neutralizing.
I mean, yeah, these are great questions. For me, Jackie, your question for me comes back to propaganda, right? Which, propaganda as discourse as all the different modes of communication that one could engage in, right? And so, you mentioned mutual aid. Mutual aid under COVID is a form of communication, right? Where people, it's and if done properly, it's a way to demonstrate the necessity of an abolitionist analysis, the necessity of self-organization, the necessity of being prepared to have power and to lead, right? And so I hear you around, this question of, attempting to persuade a mass audience could very easily slip into a kind of a performative, liberal, very easily captured form of activism. But I do think that folks are really savvy these days, like young people, my students and other folks who are organizing, at sort of using their organizing as a form of political communication, you know what I mean? And so that's sort of how I think about it. Regarding the question of pedagogy, yeah, I mean, I would love to hear whatever people, whatever suggestions people have. Is something I struggle with too. I also tell my students that, we need to think about our class as a study group for the same reasons you just mentioned, Jackie. There's a lot of things I'm not strict about as a professor, but one thing I am strict about is that everything has to be handed in on time. And part of that is not around, some kind of an arbitrary, authoritarian, desire to make sure people can, conform to my demands, but because people need to be able to build collective accountability, right? And that we need to be able to be where we say we're going to be and do what we say we're going to do when we say we're going to do it, right? That's a kind of ethic of collective accountability, not as you need to meet this demand because I say so. And I also try to, and I'm still working with how to do this effectively. I try to structure my assignments so that they're open-ended, which just makes a lot of people really uncomfortable, right? And then we have to have the conversation around, like, why is it that the opportunity to do what you want to do with this assignment makes you uncomfortable? Like, let's talk about how schooling, let's talk about how 20 years of schooling has beaten the creativity out of you and terrified you out of, approaching your assignments and your studies with a sense of spontaneity and creativity and self-direction, and try to make that conversation into a kind of productive and politicizing space of, like, look, you have this opportunity to actually explore something that you're passionate about. Like, let's figure out how to make that work for you. So those are two small ways that I try to do it.
Thank you both. Absorbing that. Thank you.
I'm going to pop in here and say what an amazing conversation. Just so much richness on the table to work through and think with, so many challenges also to work through and think with. I imagine everybody in this conversation is not going to sleep tonight, and maybe they're never going to sleep again, thinking about the challenges that you've laid out for us. We're going to start taking some questions from the audience, from the participants, and we're going to lead off with this one. Being in prison, I would love for prisons to be abolished. Question: how do we do that? I feel like the government would not allow that. Jackie, I'm going to come to you first and ask you to respond, and then Dylan and Ori, if you want to jump in as well, please do so.
I think actually the point about the government will not allow that is a really good point. This is what I mean. It's almost like the state has an immune response where it's automatically self-preserving. And this is why I do think that it is to me, it seems risky and perhaps misguided to say that the state can be separated from the security function, because the way that the state maintains itself is through its monopoly on force. So just to say the state is about the organized provisioning of public goods, I think it is missing the self-preserving dimension of the state. So to me, it's a matter of attacking it from the outside. So will we be able to legislate the end of prisons and police? I really don't think that through that channel that is a possibility. So I do think it has to take the form of collective struggle against the state, against prisons and police and the security apparatus.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, this is why I started my comments with talking about the national security state. And this is why I appreciate Dylan's comments about intimacy with violence. I mean, the abolition of prisons means destabilizing the state's monopoly over legitimate violence, right? So the question of how, this is what I mean about like forums like this actually militate against certain kinds of engagement, right? And the question of how, now you're talking about tactics, and you're talking about tactics to 3 professors, right? And so I would argue that we're not actually the ones who are going to answer the question of how, right? I'm not, right? I'm someone who looks at past cycles of struggle. And the reason why I look at past cycles of struggle is because A, because there's a lot to be excavated there. B, because it's a safety issue. If I were asking the kinds of questions and using the kinds of methodologies that I use in my work about the 70s, if I were doing that about what was happening now, that would be very unsafe for me and my family, right? So, you know, I think that if we look at the sort of histories of abolitionist struggle, you know, Dylan invoked Du Bois, the general strike. I invoked Attica and Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, right? The people who actually enliven, actualize, create those movements are the ones who are under conditions of extreme duress and violence, right? And so what we have now with Jailhouse Lawyers Speak is them issuing a call to shut the prisons down. And they're issuing this call and preparing their actions despite the fact that they know that severe repression will be meted out against them for any effort to disrupt the prison. And they're issuing a call for principled, militant, radical solidarity for people from people outside the walls, right? And so the questions about how will be found there and in those relationships. That's my political analysis. And I think part of the counterinsurgency is when professors pretend like they're the ones who have the answers to those questions.
So yeah, so I think I'm in general agreement with both Jackie and Ori here. But I'm going to venture out into something that might attract their ire a little bit, but that's okay. On the one hand, let's agree prisons will not be abolished by the state. Let's just address that part of the question that came forward. The state itself will not actually abolish the prisons, right? That's not how it's going to happen. What I do think we have gotten a glimpse of from different positions is the possibility of weaponizing whatever we have at our disposal to exacerbate a crisis of legitimacy. Okay, so I didn't think I would encounter a historical moment, at least in my lifetime, in which the language of policing as anti-Blackness, anti-Black genocide, etc., would be as commonly circulating as it was for a moment in 2020. I never thought I would see a moment in which some of my fakest ass academic colleagues would actually try to take on the identity of abolitionists and put it on their Twitter handles. I never thought I would see that, because these are the same people who would laugh and roll their eyes every time the term abolition came up in the room. Never thought I'd see that. So there's a crisis of legitimacy that happens, and I think it's still probably present. And I think, to get at the point of the question, the abolition of prisons it's probably more likely to happen by blowing open the crisis of legitimacy rather than allowing counterinsurgency to domesticate and rein it back in, by blowing that open, which I think in turn can create more possibilities for collective autonomy and fugitivity, meaning escape. And there is no formula. There's not necessarily a formula for that. I think there are formulas for it, right? Because people do it. But I'm not saying there's a formula for it. I'm saying the proliferation of possibilities for autonomy and fugitivity can happen when you are destroying an oppressive legitimacy, right? That's more likely to be what leads to the abolition of prisons, right? It's not going to be through the states kind of correcting itself. That's not how it's going to work. I think this is the point. This is the part that may be in tension with some of what my friends are saying. I actually think that people like us do have a small but nonetheless in some ways significant role to play in the creative work of delegitimation. That's why I spent so much time framing it, right? The work of delegitimation. And I think about, for example, by way of example, the Pelican Bay hunger strike started in 2011, and it kept going in wave after wave after wave, right? These are folks who were under security housing unit conditions that organized a hunger strike that spread across the country. It inspired the Georgia prison strike. What's interesting and important about paying attention to how these strikes, led and formulated and sustained by incarcerated people, the way they work, is that there are constant call outs to people in the free world to support them, right? And it's not just to support them by way of funding, it's to support them by way of intellectual and knowledge and creative production, right? There's a need that folks have who are incarcerated to call out to folks in the free world to say, we need your support in the whatever public sphere you can access to give a kind of radical legitimacy to what we are doing, right? To legitimate it in the way we want it legitimated, not to let it get pulled back into the state's legitimations, nor to feed into the state's militarized repression of our strike. So I think that there's, again, a small role, but a nonetheless significant role that professional intellectuals can and should play in legitimating the wildness. Let's put it that way. Maybe not legitimating it, in circulating and valorizing and honoring it. Let's forget legitimating, right? In valorizing and honoring the wildness, praising the shit out of it, right? Taking all the costs that come with that, right? But I'm talking about just straight praising it, right? Saying I'm overjoyed, I'm happy, I'm intellectually fulfilled by this prison strike. You know what I mean? Like I'm saying like that, and tell that shit, because this is not what we're supposed to do. You know what I mean? Academics aren't supposed to do that. We're supposed to just study it. We're not supposed to honor, valorize, and praise it. So maybe that's, and I get this inspiration from people that radical intellectuals that were actually part of revolutionary and radical anti-colonial liberation movements, who that's part of what they would do. and the opposing forces would call them propaganda. It's like, cool, call us whatever you want, right? But what you don't like is that we are circulating a kind of a feeling as well as an intellectual alliance with what's happening here that is unmitigated, that is unapologetic, and that is in like direct co-conspiratorial movement with what people are doing. More than alliance, more than solidarity, something like that. That's at least that's the aspiration. I'm just gonna think aspirationally right now, but that's how that's what I tell myself anyways. That's, you're talking about not sleeping tonight. That's how I sometimes go to sleep at night, Catherine, is I tell myself, okay, I got this little role I can play, right? And also, frankly, I think we should enjoy doing it. We should love the hate. We should enjoy it. Like, we should enjoy doing that.
Thank you all. Those are fantastic answers. Oh, we've got so many questions coming in. The next one is, I think, follows pretty nicely from the point that you were just making, Dylan. Thank you for this amazing conversation. Many of us have been deeply moved by the recent heroic escape of 6 Palestinian political prisoners from one of the most notoriously brutal Israeli prisons. I wonder if you all might reflect on your theorizations of colonial racial violence and abolitionist praxis in the context of occupied Palestine in this political moment. Ori, I'm going to kick this one to you first.
Sure. First of all, we should acknowledge that the last 2 escapees were recaptured today, right? So they managed to evade capture for 2 weeks. And so now, they're probably undergoing, unimaginable terror, because that's how prisons all over the world work. The other thing so this is, when we talk about abolition as a praxis, right? They escaped through an underground tunnel, and their supporters crowdsourced a manual for ways to support them, including leaving baskets of food outside that they could eat, and calling in a whole series of misleading tips, hundreds of misleading tips, sending authorities on the wrong trail, right? And so, people sort of improvised ways to sort of support these people. And I think that is the kind of improvisational work that abolition requires. The question of, and this is again why I was trying to talk about the national security state, because I was trying to just sort of conjure the international dimensions of the prison industrial complex. Of course, there are deep economic synergies and relationships between prisons in Israel and prisons in the United States, and just sort of generalized technologies of warfare, right? In my work on the Attica Rebellion, I'm trying to trace some of the solidarity between the Attica brothers, many of whom understood themselves to be anti-colonial insurgencies, right? Fighting against a regime of domestic colonialism at home and a system of globalized empire abroad. And so after Attica, there's an exchange that's facilitated by radical and militant lawyers, in which the Attica rebels cite Palestinians as among their inspirations. And we also know that in Palestine, George Jackson's writings were translated into Arabic and circulated, right? And so there is a tradition not only of, Black Palestinian solidarity that's rooted in a kind of shared experience of oppression and dehumanization and incapacitation and captivity, but also specific forms of solidarity in terms of the sort of radical prison movement. And again, when we talk about technology, Jackie mentioned technology and subversion. and evasion of these different technologies of capture. Think about the implications of that Attica brothers who were in solitary confinement managed to communicate internationally, right, with anti-colonial revolutionaries in Palestine under these conditions of extreme duress, right? And so for them, and the basis of that communication was a desire to formalize some kind of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist relationship. And so, you know, yeah, the sort of resonances can be talked about at length, but I'm thankful for that question and the invitation to bring that into the conversation.
I'm actually just going to pull in the next question because I think it rides on the previous three questions that we've already engaged. I'm going to kick this one to Dylan first. The questioner says, this is a question that has confused me for a while. I completely agree that the state is not the only possible form of community where people can strive, and it definitely is not the best. However, given the context of capitalist globalization and the existence of extremely powerful militant powers and their possibly colonial nature, are stateless societies possible outside of the national security systems of states? Or can they only be societies against states within states?
First, let me say how much I appreciate the thoughtfulness of that question. And let me go. It actually, you're right, it does mesh with the previous question, because let me respond to the previous question as a way to actually seg into a response to this one. Because I think what's so beautiful about what happened in Palestine with the 6 brothers that escaped, regardless of their being recaptured, these 6 people are living poetry, right? They're actually embodied art. That's what they're embodied abolitionist art. That's what they are. They testified to the truth of the genocidal apartheid Israeli state in poetic fugitive form. They performed the fracturing and downfall of that state, its illegitimacy as an occupying apartheid genocidal force. That is what they performed. That is what they embody now under the conditions of recapture. So there's that. The poetry of their escape is what is dangerous to the legitimacy of Israel's carceral colonial state power. Regardless, maybe even more so, because they've been recaptured. Their escape is both blueprint and inspiration. It is both. And that's what poems do for us a lot of times, right? Sometimes it's both. Poems are both those things, right? They're blueprint and they're inspiration. What they've done is create a story that'll be told over and over again endlessly, because what they performed, what they did cultivates, and this gets at this question now, it cultivates an abolitionist speculation that refuses the legitimacy. That's what the escape does. It cultivates, it stokes the speculation that I was talking about. I think all 4 of us in some ways have been talking about in different ways. So that speculation is what pushes back against the kind of, the kind of historical narcissism that we have, that sometimes confounds us into believing that these massive apparatuses of authority and oppressive power that overwhelm our particular generations, or maybe recent generations as well, will always exist, right? Like, I mean, that's just a form of kind of this. So what speculation does is it ruptures us from that kind of historical compartmentalization of imagination. And what it also does, in addition to pushing us toward a speculation, a kind of a speculative practice, is it also allows us to have a kind of perception of what people actually do in liberated territories and liberated communities and liberated kind of spaces of being throughout the archive of chattel slavery, colonialism, and incarceration, right? We can think about, this is why I am going to be reading and assigning Ori's book as soon as it comes out, like in every one of my fucking classes, right? Because what Attica produced, you know, and again, I think this is what pushes back against a certain kind of narrative of Attica that I think, unfortunately, Heather Thompson and others have reproduced. Unfortunately, I think that's a tragedy. Despite the scholarship being solid, I don't like the way it's reproduced some kind of narrative of Attica that Ori corrects. I'm happy, I'm thrilled, grateful that Ori corrects it, because what Attica actually opened up is this kind of speculation, and it produced the notion of a continuity, a resurgence, a kind of resilience and creativity of Black radical organizing, thought, pedagogy, collective abolitionist fugitivity all the time under conditions of incarceration that both survives the conditions of incarceration and also formulates the downfall of the regime. Right. And so to respond to this question in a really concrete archival way, we're already plotting that society, y'all. We're already plotting that. I heard it in what Jackie was saying. Like, we've already got the seeds of a proliferating wild kind of set of plans and experiments that we're already kind of starting to do anyways. I'll put it in the chat. The two folks I always talk about recently are Amika Tendahi and Martine Cavero, who are the two co-founders of Ujima Medics in Southside Chicago. I know we're running out of time. We're starting to run short on time. I'm not going to talk about what they've done. I'll put the link to their organization in the chat. I'm thinking about folks like that. I'm thinking about the archivists at Southern California Library in South LA, you know, Yusef Omawali and Michelle Welsing, who are, again, stoking the speculative imagination, bringing us back to the archive, showing us how the kind of imagination of those societies outside states against national security systems in rupture and fugitivity and escape from them. They've always been there. They've always been in the making. And so, in my view, there's nothing that's really inevitable per se, but I think as forms of human being, these things are so persistent that they will outlast these apparatuses of dominance that we are currently experiencing, right? And shit, given what happened in the last 18 months, I'm no longer going to say that I don't care if it happens in my lifetime. I used to say that, right? Now I do kind of care because I think it might, you know, and I want to be part of it. And I don't know that I can be, by the way. My own limitations make it clear that I might not be ready for that. And I'm cool. Y'all can just push me over there. Like I'll go by myself because I might not be ready for that liberated side, but I'm trying to encourage everyone else to be.
Thanks, Dylan. I think we've got time for one more question. I'm gonna, this takes us in a slightly different direction, but is totally in tune with many of the themes that you've developed over the course of this conversation. I'm gonna ask Jackie to take the lead on the response to this. The DOC, the Department of Corrections here in Maine, is adopting a, quote, culture of wellness, unquote, including humanization, normalization, destigmatization, and modernization. They claim to be taking a different way of approaching corrections. Isn't this a form of counterinsurgency?
This actually, I was peer reviewing an article this week, and this is something you have to do as an academic. And it was opposing the article was opposing a security and control approach to using prison algorithms to a rehabilitation approach. And I actually made the comment that rehabilitation as a prison ideology can be a form of counterinsurgency. This is a point that Nicole Fleetwood makes in Marking Time in her analysis of the history of prison arts program, that yeah, it had this rehabilitative mission, but it was also aimed at keeping incarcerated people occupied by giving them things to do so they would be calm and there wouldn't be social unrest. So I do think that we need to really think critically about rehabilitation as an ideology that is ultimately geared at counterinsurgency. And we see this in terms of how programs are ultimately implemented to literally try to stop people from doing political organizing, from trying to prevent social disturbances using rehabilitation. So I think this also feeds into what we were discussing in terms of the reformist agenda being the process by which the carceral state expands, and rehabilitation as an orientation. First of all, it pathologizes prisoners. It says that there's something wrong with you that needs to be fix. So we should be critical of it for that reason. But it also is about re-legitimizing the prison system, like saying the prison system shouldn't be questioned if it has this rehabilitative goal. And I think that's something as abolitionists, we should be very critical of.
If I could just jump in briefly, I mean, also the language of modernization, you know, used in the international context, you know, during the Cold War was a cover for counterinsurgency explicitly, right? Modernization is also what how Rockefeller described what he did to the New York prison system after Attica. He also used the word humanization, right? And so I actually looked that up about the main prison system in advance of this, and my interest was piqued by those two keywords in particular, as well as rehabilitation. Again, if you look at the rehabilitation literature in the term rehabilitation in the military prison literature, it's very clear that it's being used interchangeably with re-education, right? I mean, they're explicit about that when you're talking about military prisons abroad. And obviously, many of the people who are running military prisons get circulated back into domestic prisons. So it's the same actors doing the same things. It's just a slight change in terms, right? But Jackie's exactly right. And this is psychological warfare, changing people's attitudes and behaviors, trying to make them calm, doing everything from changing the color of the paint in the wall to bringing in volunteers from the outside so that they get sort of a taste of outside life. All of these things are done to extend the life of the prison. And what we're trying to do is shorten the life of the prison. And so, but we're faced with a tension, right, between obviously the immediate need to offer relief to people who are suffering, but figuring out how to do that in ways that shorten rather than extend the life of this oppressive regime.
Thank you. Beautiful answers. Thank you all three of you so much for joining us tonight and for occupying this space, putting out so many complex but also crystal clear concepts, challenges, ways to think, things to think with. I think this has been the most remarkable kickoff to this series that we're hosting that I could imagine. I invite all the listeners to pay careful attention to what Ori, Dylan, and Jackie are doing, and to the work that they're putting out in the public sphere, and also to the abolitionist work that they're doing. I also want to invite the listeners to next week's discussion, Monday night discussion, same time, same place. The sort of leading question is, what does abolition feel like? And this is going to be led by performance artist Anna Martine Whitehead, who is going to be discussing her artistic practice focused on how she centers Black liberation, queer livingness, and creative alternatives to policing and prisons in her own work. Her artist talk will be followed by a conversation between Whitehead and performer and poet Gabrielle Civil. So thanks everybody for joining us. Enormous thanks to the panelists for this incredibly stimulating conversation. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all.
Good night.